North Atlantic Ocean, November 1944. The sea is black and endless, rolling beneath a sky without stars. Inside a German U-boat, the air is thick with diesel fumes and fear. Men sit motionless, their faces pale in the dim red glow of emergency lamps. Each breath echoes louder than words. Somewhere above them, unseen in the freezing dark, the enemy listens. A sound pierces the silence. A sharp, metallic ping. Then another, and another. The rhythm is steady, inhuman, like a machine heartbeat pulsing through the depths. Every man knows what it means. Allied sonar. The destroyers are sweeping the ocean floor, searching for them. The captain grips the periscope handles, eyes hollow. He whispers to no one, "They can hear us breathe." Another ping. Closer now, louder, almost inside their skulls. The pressure hull creaks, and water trickles somewhere aft. Someone begins to pray. Above them, a British destroyer's operators trace the echoes. The sonar screen flickers, a pulse returns, faint but alive. The operator turns to his commander. "Contact confirmed, sir. Bearing 09. Below, the German captain knows the truth. They are no longer the hunters of the Atlantic. They are the hunted. When war erupted in 1939, Germany's greatest advantage did not roar through the skies or roll across the continent. It lurked beneath the sea. The Uboat Waffe, Hitler's submarine arm, was designed to strangle Britain's lifeline. Its merchant shipping, an island empire that survived on imported food, fuel, and weapons could not last long if its arteries were cut beneath the waves. In the first months of the Battle of the Atlantic, the ocean seemed to belong to the Kriegsmarine. German U-boats slipped from ports like Wilhelmshaven and Lorient under cover of night, gliding silently through fog and storm. Each patrol meant weeks of darkness, diesel fumes, and silence, but also pride. Early in the war, Allied escorts were few, radar primitive and sonar unreliable. The Atlantic was vast, and the submariners believed it favored them. By 1940 and 1941, Admiral Karl Dönitz had perfected the doctrine that terrified Allied sailors: the Wolfpack. Dozens of submarines coordinated attacks through encoded radio signals, striking convoys from multiple angles at night. Under the moonlight, torpedoes carved fiery wounds across the sea. Merchantmen burned until dawn. The British called it their tonnage war, a desperate effort to build ships faster than they were sunk. For a time, Germany seemed unstoppable. Each U-boat returned to cheering crowds and iron crosses. Newspapers in Berlin hailed the captains as modern knights of the deep. Churchill himself would later confess, "The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril." But the triumph was built on fragile mathematics. Every voyage cost fuel, men, and precious machinery that Germany could not easily replace. And the Allies were learning fast. By late 1941, the Royal Navy and the U.S. Navy had begun to form convoy systems, large, slow-moving groups of merchant ships shielded by destroyers and corvettes. Aircraft from Iceland, Greenland, and Britain began to patrol the skies, forcing the U-boats to submerge by day. Once submerged, a U-boat was half-blind and slow, its batteries draining rapidly. The hunters were beginning to feel hunted. Technology, once Germany's secret weapon, was turning against them. The Allies improved their Aztec sonar systems, capable of bouncing sound waves through the ocean and reading the faintest echoes. What had been an invisible battlefield was suddenly illuminated by sound. Each ping told a story: distance, bearing, depth. In time, trained operators could tell if a submarine was turning, diving, or simply waiting in silence. Still, through 1942, the Atlantic remained a graveyard of ships. The United States, newly at war, sent hundreds of convoys eastward across the ocean, often without enough escorts. U-boats prowled the coasts of America, torpedoing tankers within sight of coastal cities, whose lights guided them like beacons. The Americans called it the Second Happy Time, a period when German submariners sank nearly 1 million tons of shipping per month. But even as they celebrated, the tide was shifting. The Allies poured resources into what Winston Churchill called the Wizard War. the race for electronic supremacy. Radar sets were fitted onto aircraft, magnetic detectors sensed submerged metal, and high-frequency direction-finding towers tracked radio messages that the U-boats used to coordinate attacks. Unknown to Dönitz, the Allies were also reading his communications through Ultra, the secret program that had cracked the Enigma cipher. By mid-1943, the hunters found themselves ambushed in return. Destroyers raced toward sonar contacts, depth charges thundered like underwater earthquakes, and planes dropped patterns of bombs from the clouds. The once invisible Wolfpacks were being torn apart. The sea was no longer safe. Inside the U-boats, the mood turned from pride to paranoia. Crews whispered about new Allied technology. Machines that could hear a man's heartbeat, detectors that could track the faint sound of breathing or the rhythm of propellers. They did not understand sonar's science, only its terror. To them, it was as if the ocean itself had turned against them, echoing their every movement back to the enemy. And as 1944 approached, the German U-boat fleet, once the terror of the Atlantic, faced extinction. By 1943, the Atlantic had transformed from a battlefield of guesswork into a realm of scientific precision. The Allied navies no longer fought by instinct alone. They fought by mathematics, by magnetism, by sound. Every escort ship carried a small, humming heart in its hull, the Aztec sonar set, the Allies' answer to the invisible predator. The system emitted a focused pulse, a metallic ping that traveled through salt water and returned as an echo when it struck metal. A skilled operator could listen to that echo and imagine the unseen. A submarine's course, its angle, its panic. In the hands of experienced crews, sonar became more than an instrument. It was a weapon of psychological warfare. Submariners described the sound of those pings as unbearable. Each one seemed closer, sharper, as though the ocean itself were collapsing around them. There was no escape from sound. At the same time, Allied radar technology expanded across the skies. British and American patrol planes equipped with Lee lights, brilliant search lamps attached to bombers, could now detect and illuminate U-boats surfacing to recharge their batteries. In the glare of those beams, steel hulls glistened for only seconds before depth charges rained down. The Atlantic War had become a chessboard played across 3 dimensions. Radar above, sonar below, and Enigma intercepts in between. The Germans fought back with innovation. Admiral Dönitz ordered the development of Schnorkel, a retractable air tube allowing submarines to run diesel engines while submerged. Theoretically, it made them invisible to radar. In practice, it only delayed the inevitable. The devices were fragile and noisy, betraying their presence to sonar. The more the U-boats tried to hide, the louder they became to the listening ears of Allied destroyers. Meanwhile, British scientists at Fairley and Dunstable laboratories refined sonar to remarkable precision. The new 147B Sword horizontal fan sonar could sweep large sections of ocean and retain contact with submarines even during attacks. This ended the era of blind bombing, allowing destroyers to drop depth charges while maintaining sonar lock. A technological leap that shattered U-boat morale. By early 1944, the statistics told the truth more brutally than propaganda ever could. Over 70% of German submariners were dead. Out of 40,000 who served, more than 30,000 would never return. Entire classes of cadets vanished after their first patrols. The Kriegsmarine had lost not just machines, but belief. Belief that the sea was their ally. The Allies had achieved what no navy in history had done before: total acoustic domination of the ocean. Their new systems could distinguish between the echoes of a whale and the vibration of a U-boat hull. Experimental devices even detected variations in water density and pressure waves caused by a submarine's movement. Among German sailors, these rumors grew into myth: that the British could hear the human body itself, the faint rhythm of heartbeats amplified by the steel walls of a submarine. Though technically exaggerated, the fear was real. Sonar had reached such sensitivity that even minor mechanical sounds, a shifting valve, a loose wrench, could betray a position. Silence became impossible. Crews began to live in terror of their own breathing. The final blow came with the introduction of escort carriers, small aircraft carriers accompanying convoys. These floating airfields allowed constant air patrols over the mid-Atlantic, once called the Black Gap, where submarines had hunted safely for years. Now there was no gap, no refuge. The hunter's ocean had been divided into sound grids and radar zones, every square mile watched by machines and men. By the end of 1944, the German submarine campaign had collapsed into despair. Captains no longer hunted convoys. They fled them. Many U-boats surrendered upon surfacing, their white flags fluttering above waters where their comrades had vanished. The Atlantic, once the graveyard of Allied ships, had become a graveyard of German dreams. From this silence of defeat, one haunting question lingered. If technology could pierce even the depths of the ocean, could any place in war remain hidden? 1. The human angle. Life and fear. Beneath the waves, to live inside a U-boat was to exist between steel and silence. The average Type 7 submarine, the backbone of the Kriegsmarine, was barely 220 feet long, smaller than a modern passenger jet, yet carried over 50 men. Every inch was filled. Torpedoes stacked beside bunks, oil and sweat clinging to the air, pipes rattling as the hull flexed under pressure. The crew slept in shifts, their faces pressed against cold metal or one another's shoulders. Silence was survival. Even a dropped wrench or whispered word could echo through the water and betray them. Crew members learned to hold their breath when the sonar pings began, not out of superstition, but instinct. They believed the enemy above could hear it. Fear became a constant companion. When depth charges exploded nearby, the hull groaned like a dying creature. Lights flickered. Paint peeled from the bulkheads. Bolts popped loose, spraying seawater. Veterans described the experience as being inside a giant drum while God beats on it. Many broke under the pressure, not of water, but of waiting. In diaries later recovered, German sailors wrote of hearing phantom pings even while in port, of dreaming of echoes in their sleep. Some begged their commanders to surface, even knowing it meant surrender. In the final months of the war, morale collapsed so completely that crews often argued whether to scuttle their boats or raise the white flag before the first shot was fired. Yet despite the fear, many U-boat sailors remained astonishingly professional. Their discipline and technical skill impressed even their enemies. When captured, Allied officers often remarked on their youth. Boys of 19, pale and hollow-eyed, trained to kill and die in darkness. These men had once been promised heroism. Now they were only promised silence. The sea that had once hidden them now betrayed them at every turn. The technological angle. The ocean. Learns to listen. Sonar changed everything. Before the 1940s, naval warfare had relied on sight, on horizon lines, periscopes, and binoculars. But beneath the surface, sight was useless. Sound became the new sense of war. British engineers had begun experimenting with underwater acoustics during World War I, creating primitive echo-ranging devices. By World War II, these had evolved into ASDIC, named after the Anti-Submarine Detection Investigation Committee. It was crude by later standards, but revolutionary at the time. A rotating transducer sent sound waves into the sea, and when they struck metal, an echo returned to a display screen or to the operator's headphones. At first, it seemed almost mystical, hearing an enemy you could not see. Early operators learned to recognize not just distance, but movement, turning rate, and speed. Instructors trained them using recorded echoes from captured U-boats, teaching the human ear to interpret sound the way a pilot reads instruments. As the war progressed, sonar became both more advanced and more personal. The ping was a declaration of presence. "We know you're there." Destroyer crews described it as the heartbeat of the ship. When contact was lost, silence felt unbearable. When the echo returned, adrenaline surged. Entire depth charge attacks were timed to the rhythm of that sound. The Germans tried to respond. They coated their hulls with synthetic rubber called alberic, designed to absorb sonar waves. They deployed noise-making decoys called bold, canisters that released bubbles to confuse the enemy. For a while, these tricks worked. But the Allies adapted faster. They refined frequency ranges, introduced continuous wave sonar, and developed new listening techniques that could even identify the distinctive hum of German propellers. To the Allies, the sonar operator was both scientist and hunter. To the Germans, he was a phantom god, invisible, omnipresent, always listening. The belief that sonar could hear heartbeats was not far from truth. In certain conditions, sonar did detect biological noise, the faint vibrations of bodies, the mechanical rhythm of lungs through steel. The human imagination filled in the rest. By 1944, this technology had turned the Atlantic into a vast listening chamber. Every convoy was a moving orchestra of echoes, propellers, and metallic signatures. The ocean, once an ally of stealth, had become an acoustic trap. Each new ping that rolled through the dark water was more than a pulse of sound. It was the sound of inevitability, of a war where hiding was no longer possible. And above all, it signaled a change not just in weapons, but in the nature of fear itself. The leadership angle. Admiral Dönitz and the illusion of control. At the heart of Germany's submarine war stood Admiral Karl Dönitz, a man both brilliant and blind. A veteran of World War I, Dönitz had been among the first to see the submarine not as a supporting weapon, but as a strategic tool of annihilation. He envisioned an invisible fleet choking Britain's trade routes, forcing surrender without a single soldier landing on English soil. In the early years, his vision seemed prophetic. The U-boat was Germany's cheapest and most efficient weapon, capable of sinking millions of tons of shipping with minimal resources. Dönitz became the architect of the Wolfpack, a predator's doctrine in which submarines coordinated attacks like a pack of wolves circling prey. He personally managed deployments from his bunker at Caroman Base in occupied France, directing the movements of dozens of boats through encrypted radio. But Dönitz's brilliance was also his undoing. His obsession with communication, the very coordination that made the Wolfpack deadly, made the fleet vulnerable. Every message transmitted by radio became a beacon for Allied intelligence. Unknown to him, Bletchley Park had broken the Enigma code, turning his centralized control into a liability. As losses mounted, Dönitz refused to yield. He called for total faith in the submarine arm, demanding new boats, new technology, and unwavering morale. To the end, he believed a decisive blow was still possible, a mythical turning of the tide. He spoke of the new type 21 U-boat, a faster, deeper-diving, revolutionary vessel that could restore the Reich's dominance. But by the time it was ready, the war was already lost. When Germany surrendered, Dönitz briefly became Hitler's successor, a bitter irony for a man who had spent the war beneath the surface. In his final speech as Reich president, he said simply, "The German people have given everything. The sea was against us." He was right. The sea itself had turned into the enemy. The enemy's perspective. The Allied destroyer crews above the water. On British and American destroyers, a different kind of tension reigned. The sonar operators, mostly young men in their 20s, lived with their ears pressed to headphones for hours on end, listening to the ocean's whispers. The sound of propellers, of currents, of the faint pulse of machinery far below. They described it as a haunting symphony. Most of what they heard was nothing. Random echoes, drifting schools of fish, the hum of their own engines. But once in a while they heard the unmistakable resonance of a submarine's hull. That moment changed everything. "Contact!" someone would shout. Officers sprinted to stations, engines roared, and sailors manned the depth charge racks. The ship turned hard to port or starboard, closing in on the invisible echo. For the next 5 minutes, the destroyer became a hammer, the sea its anvil. After the explosions, there was silence, only bubbles and oil on the water. Sometimes wreckage surfaced, sometimes nothing. The sonar operator would return to his headphones, listening again, knowing another U-boat might be waiting somewhere else. Many Allied sailors admitted later that they felt both pity and awe for the men they hunted. They knew what it meant to be trapped in darkness, unable to fight back. The U-boat war was not one of hatred, but of endurance, of two groups of young men locked in a contest of nerves, guided by machines they barely understood. For the Allies, sonar had become a sixth sense. For the Germans, it was a death sentence written in sound. The moral angle. The sound of an invisible death. The Battle of the Atlantic was unlike any other front in World War II. There were no civilians, no cities, no flags planted in victory. Only ships vanishing beneath waves that swallowed their names. It was a war fought in isolation, where death was often unseen and mercy came too late. In this silent battlefield, technology blurred the line between man and machine. Sonar, radar, cryptography, all tools of intellect, reduced human beings to blips, bearings, and echoes. The ocean did not distinguish courage from fear or youth from experience. It was an equalizer. To the Allied captains, sonar represented progress, proof that reason and science could triumph over terror. To the German sailors, it symbolized doom, an invisible power that stripped them of their last defense: invisibility. Many later said that the sound of sonar haunted them for years, echoing in their dreams long after the war ended. In the final months of 1944, surrender became an act of sanity. U-boats surfaced not because they were destroyed, but because they were defeated by fear itself. They raised white flags in open water, trembling under the gaze of ships they could not see. For the first time, the sea, once the great hiding place of mankind, had no shadows left. The world had entered a new kind of warfare, one defined not by what could be seen, but by what could be heard. April 1945. North Atlantic. The war in Europe was already lost, though few at sea dared to say it aloud. The Reich's cities lay in ruins, its armies scattered. But deep in the Atlantic, hundreds of German U-boats still drifted beneath the waves, ghosts of a dying empire, carrying men who had not yet heard the last order. In these final months, the ocean became a graveyard of despair. Allied sonar swept constantly across the cold, dark water. The destroyers and corvettes patrolled in lines, their operators listening for the faintest echoes of steel. Every few hours, a ping would return from the depths. Another submarine, another heartbeat in the dark. U-boat captains knew the end was near. Orders from Admiral Dönitz's headquarters demanded they continue fighting. But fuel was scarce, food was rotten, and morale was gone. Many crews no longer dreamed of victory, only of surfacing alive. Among them was U-1105, commanded by Oberleutnant Hans-Joachim Schwarz. Known as the Black Panther for its experimental rubber-coated hull designed to absorb sonar, it was one of Germany's most advanced submarines. Yet even its stealth could not silence the ocean's relentless rhythm. Allied sonar had become too sensitive, too perfect. On April 29, 1945, U-1105 was hiding at periscope depth off the coast of Northern Ireland when the pings began. At first faint, then louder, faster, closer, like a heartbeat approaching panic. The crew froze. Every sound inside the submarine, a cough, a clatter, even a sigh, seemed deafening. The captain ordered silent running. All machinery halted. Men stood motionless in the stale air, but silence was no longer protection. The sonar operators aboard the British frigates HMS Loch Glendu and HMS Loch Moore had locked onto the U-boat's position. The ships moved in, adjusting speed and angle with clinical precision. The operators could even hear the faint vibrations of the U-boat's electric motors. Winding down, then came the Hedgehog, a forward-firing anti-submarine mortar that launched a pattern of explosives ahead of the ship. Unlike depth charges, which detonated at preset depths, Hedgehogs exploded only on contact. The sea erupted in a string of flashes. Moments later, a dull roar echoed through the U-boat. Pipes burst. Lights went out. Schwarz knew the next salvo would destroy them. He ordered ballast blown and surfaced. As the submarine broke through the waves, its black hull glistening under gray daylight, the crew rushed to the deck, waving improvised white flags, shirts, bed sheets, anything they could find. Above them, British sailors watched through binoculars, stunned. German submariners were surfacing voluntarily, a sight no one expected in the Atlantic War. Across the ocean, similar scenes unfolded. In the final weeks of April and May 1945, dozens of U-boats surfaced and surrendered without resistance. Some sent radio messages offering coordinates to Allied forces, preferring capture over death. Others scuttled their vessels after surfacing, choosing the sea as their final grave but sparing their crews. What broke them was not hunger or defeat alone. It was sound, the endless sonar pings, the feeling of being hunted through water, the knowledge that the enemy could hear them even when they whispered. Allied propaganda had whispered for months that the ocean itself betrays you, and for once, it felt true. For the submariners, surrender was not shame. It was mercy. Men who had once stalked convoys in pride now wept openly on the decks of Allied ships, relieved to breathe fresh air. British sailors handed them cigarettes, blankets, and hot tea. The war beneath the waves had ended not with gunfire, but with exhaustion. When U-1105 was captured, Allied engineers were astonished by its technology, its sonar-absorbing coating, its advanced systems. But more astonishing was the testimony of its crew. They swore that the Allied sonar could hear through the hull, that the British had machines that detected heartbeats. The scientists laughed at the exaggeration. Yet secretly they knew how close the Germans were to the truth. The latest Allied sonar, codenamed Type 147, could indeed detect the faint mechanical vibrations of breathing apparatus and motor pumps. In the psychological dimension of war, it was enough. The Germans no longer fought an enemy of flesh and steel. They fought the echo of their own fear. The Atlantic, once their hunting ground, had turned into a mirror. Every sound, every breath, every heartbeat reflected back to them until they broke. By May 1945, the U-boat arm of the Kriegsmarine was collapsing faster than the Reich it served. Hitler was dead, Berlin had fallen, and the last orders from Grand Admiral Dönitz's bunker in Flensburg were confused fragments of a lost empire. But even as German forces on land surrendered, hundreds of submarines still lurked in the Atlantic, the North Sea, and the Bay of Biscay, isolated, half-starved, and cut off from home. Allied ships and aircraft scoured the waters with unprecedented intensity. The sea was mapped by sonar pings every minute of every day. Each returning echo told of silence, or of a dying fleet. The Allied command called it Operation Teardrop, a sweeping hunt across the Atlantic to intercept submarines believed to be carrying last-resort weapons. V-1 or V-2 rockets meant for the U.S. East Coast. In reality, those U-boats carried nothing but frightened men. On May 4, 1945, Dönitz issued Order No. 509, commanding all U-boats to cease hostilities and surrender. The war beneath the sea was officially over, but the order reached the submarines slowly, and many captains doubted it. Some feared it was an Allied trick broadcast on captured frequencies. Others hesitated, unwilling to surface into the hands of an enemy they had fought unseen for 6 years. Then, one by one, the U-boats began to rise. All across the Atlantic, periscopes broke the surface, followed by black conning towers. British and American destroyers watched in astonishment as white flags appeared above the waves. Radio signals filled the ether. "We surrender. Request instructions." From Norway to Newfoundland, from the Bay of Biscay to the Caribbean, more than 150 submarines surfaced to surrender. Some did so at sea, others limped toward Allied ports. A few reached neutral harbors in Spain, Ireland, and Argentina, where they interned themselves. The once feared Uboat Waffe, the pride of Dönitz's navy, had dissolved into scattered remnants seeking mercy. Each surrender was a scene of quiet shock. On May 9th, U-249 surfaced off Portland, England, flying a white sheet. The British destroyer HMS Bulldog intercepted her. When the German crew climbed on deck, many were trembling, eyes sunken, clothes filthy. One sailor fell to his knees and kissed the deck of the British ship. The Allied commander later wrote, "They looked like men who had been hunted by the sea itself." The same day, U-858 surrendered off Delaware Bay, the first German submarine to give up to the U.S. Navy. Her commander, Thilo Bode, stepped forward and saluted the American boarding party before handing over his sidearm. He told the officers, "The ocean no longer hides us." Other surrenders were darker. Some captains, bound by the code of the Kriegsmarine, refused to raise the white flag. They chose to scuttle their submarines instead, flooding ballast tanks, opening valves, letting the sea swallow their iron tombs. Crews of U-530 and U-977 fled toward Argentina, vanishing into rumor and myth. But most simply gave up. For the Allies, victory at sea came not with celebration, but with disbelief. They had not merely defeated Germany's navy, they had rewritten the laws of the ocean. The sonar net that stretched across the Atlantic had proven so effective that even the most advanced submarines, coated in sound-absorbing rubber, could not hide. One British sonar officer later recalled, "It was eerie. We could hear them down there, engines dying, pumps slowing. Sometimes it sounded like a heartbeat fading. Then, nothing." That silence marked the end of an era. The Battle of the Atlantic, the longest continuous campaign of the Second World War, was finally over. Nearly 3,500 Allied merchant ships had been sunk, but at the cost of over 780 U-boats destroyed and 28,000 German submariners lost, a casualty rate of almost 75%, the highest of any branch of service in the war. When Dönitz surrendered to the Allies on May 9th, he tried to speak of honor, of courage beneath the waves. But the men who returned from the ocean were broken by a weapon they could not see or fight. Sonar had stripped away the one advantage submarines had: invisibility. And with it, the mystique of the deep. For those who survived, the haunting pings of Allied sonar remained in memory long after the war ended. Some said they still heard it in their sleep, a pulse that would not stop, echoing through time. The Atlantic grew quiet again, but for many who had fought beneath it, silence was not peace. It was the echo of everything lost. When the last U-boat surrendered, the Allied navies found themselves staring not just at defeated enemies, but at the future of warfare. Beneath the rust and ruin of Germany's submarine fleet lay technologies that would shape the next half-century of undersea strategy. The dissection of defeat. In the summer of 1945, the Royal Navy and the U.S. Navy launched Operation Deadlight, a grimly practical operation to dispose of over 150 surrendered U-boats. Before scuttling them, Allied engineers stripped each vessel bare. They measured every valve, photographed every control room, and studied the new Schnorkel breathing masts and Alberic rubber coatings. What they discovered astonished them. Despite Germany's collapse, its engineers had continued to innovate in isolation. The Type 21 and Type 23 submarines represented leaps ahead. Streamlined hulls, silent electric motors, and underwater speeds that outpaced anything the Allies had built. The war had ended before these electric boats could make an impact. But their designs became blueprints for post-war navies from Washington to Moscow. The Allies realized that the era of the surface-bound submarine was over. The ocean would never again be a hiding place. It would be a contested realm of sound, signal, and silence. The rise of acoustic intelligence, the sonar revolution of the Atlantic campaign, did not stop in 1945. British and American scientists, many from wartime sonar laboratories, continued, refining underwater acoustics into a science of listening. They developed hydrophone arrays, long chains of underwater microphones that could track vessels over hundreds of miles. By 1949, these experiments evolved into the Sound Surveillance System, SOSUS, a vast undersea listening network stretching across the Atlantic floor. It was designed to detect Soviet submarines, but its conceptual DNA traced directly to the Battle of the Atlantic. The lessons learned while hunting U-boats, echo timing, frequency analysis, and sound propagation, became the foundation of Cold War undersea detection. In effect, the war that ended in 1945 had merely shifted from combat to surveillance. The ocean had become the most closely monitored battlefield on Earth. The human debrief-captured U-boat officers were interrogated in British and American naval bases. Their testimonies revealed not only technical data, but psychological scars. Many confessed that they had surrendered not because of damage or orders, but because they could no longer bear the sound of sonar. Some reported panic attacks triggered by the rhythmic ping even in captivity. Psychologists studying these sailors coined a new term, acoustic fatigue. It described the mental collapse caused by prolonged exposure to sound as a weapon. The Allies had, perhaps unintentionally, pioneered psychological warfare through noise. The transformation of the sea post-war naval strategy changed accordingly. Every major power began investing in submarines that could dive deeper, run quieter, and mask their acoustic signatures. The race for silence became the new arms race. Nuclear propulsion, advanced propeller design, and sound-dampening materials all emerged from one lesson learned in 1945. Those who can hear will rule the deep. The once terrifying sonar ping now symbolized mastery, not fear. Yet for the men who had lived through it, the sound would forever remain a memory of surrender. As Operation Deadlight concluded in early 1946, Allied ships towed the last captured U-boats into the Atlantic and sank them with controlled explosions. The ocean boiled, then fell silent again. The commanders noted their positions precisely, not for ceremony, but for study. Each sunken hull was both a grave and a classroom, marking the point where human ingenuity met its own reflection in sound. The Battle of the Atlantic had ended, but its echoes would continue to shape the next war, one that would be fought in silence beneath the waves. When the guns fell silent, the Atlantic itself remained haunted. Beneath its surface lay more than 30,000 German submariners, entombed in their steel coffins. For decades, fishermen hauled up twisted fragments of hulls, rusted nameplates, and the occasional diary sealed in an oilskin pouch. Each fragment told the same story: a war that ended in silence. The survivor's burden. The few who survived captivity returned to a nation in ruins. For many there was no home to return to, no comrades left alive. In post-war Germany, U-boat veterans were not celebrated as heroes. They were ghosts from a defeated past, symbols of a war that the world wanted to forget. Yet within their ranks, a strange fellowship endured. Former officers met quietly in Hamburg and Kiel, writing memoirs that tried to explain what it meant to live under the sea for months at a time. They described not triumph, but terror, the claustrophobia, the nightmares, the endless sonar pings that echoed even after sleep. Some veterans admitted they would wake at night sweating, convinced they could still hear the Allied destroyers hunting them. One commander, Heinrich Lehmann Willenbrock, who had once captained the famous U-96, wrote years later, "We believed the ocean protected us, but in the end, it was the ocean that betrayed us. It carried every sound of our fear to the enemy." His words captured the truth of the submarine war, that technology had turned nature itself into a weapon. The Allied reflection among the Allied sailors, victory brought little joy. Many sonar operators who had spent nights listening to echoes now found themselves uneasy with silence. Some described feeling empathy, even guilt, knowing that the final pings they heard often meant hundreds of men were dying unseen below. Naval historians later noted that the Battle of the Atlantic was not just a clash of machines, but of endurance, a contest of nerves where the victor was not necessarily the braver, but the one who could keep listening longer. The psychological lessons of this invisible war seeped into Cold War doctrine. The U.S. Navy began training sonar technicians not just in physics, but in psychology, teaching them how to interpret sound without succumbing to its strain. The human ear, they had learned, could both win a war and destroy the mind that used it. The new silence by the 1950s, sonar had evolved from weapon to language. Scientists used it to map the ocean floor, track whales, and study underwater currents. What had once been built to kill now helped humanity explore. Yet even in exploration, the legacy of wartime fear remained. Every sonar ping carried a ghost, a reminder that sound had once been the sound of death. In Germany, memorials were quietly raised along the coastlines, granite slabs engraved with the names of lost crews, often without dates or explanations. Sie kehrten nicht zurück. They did not return. Families visited the shorelines and tossed wreaths into the sea, knowing no bodies would ever come home. And in Britain, the destroyer crews who had hunted those submarines also grew old with their memories. One former sonar operator interviewed in 1989 summed it up with weary honesty. When the ping came back, you knew they were still alive. When it stopped, you knew they were gone. That was the hardest part, the silence after. The Atlantic still holds those silences, thousands of them, layered beneath the waves like unmarked graves. By the war's end, the Battle of the Atlantic had claimed over 100,000 lives. No medals or monuments could measure the cost, but its outcome reshaped the future. It proved that sound, invisible, intangible, unstoppable, could win wars. The submariners had once believed they could outsmart the world by diving deeper. But in the end, even the deepest ocean could not hide them from the human ear. The story of the U-boat war ends not with gunfire, but with listening. It is the story of how silence became a battlefield, and how humanity, for the first time, learned to fight by sound. When German submariners surfaced to surrender in 1945, they were not merely yielding to superior firepower. They were surrendering to a new kind of intelligence, one that could hear what the eye could not see. The Allied sonar, refined through years of desperation, had transformed the sea itself into a weapon. It no longer mattered how deep a submarine could dive. The ocean carried its secrets upward, one echo at a time. For centuries, sailors had believed that the depths were unknowable, a place of mystery and safety. The Second World War ended that illusion. The sonar ping, cold, mechanical, merciless, marked the moment when technology invaded even the quietest corners of the earth. It was proof that there were no longer any true hiding places. Yet within that victory lay a warning. Every advance that helps man to see further, or to hear deeper, also strips away a little more of his mystery. The submariners, hunted by sound, were among the first to feel what all soldiers of the modern age would come to know: that war had become a contest not of courage, but of detection. In the years that followed, the same principles that tracked U-boats would map the ocean floor, locate shipwrecks, and listen for whales migrating through darkness. The instrument of fear became an instrument of discovery. But the echoes remain, faint, eternal, pulsing through the deep. Somewhere in the Atlantic, beneath thousands of meters of cold silence, the remains of U-1105 still rest on the seabed. Divers who have visited it describe an eerie stillness, broken only by the faint hum of passing currents. If you listen closely, they say, you can still imagine it. The slow, steady rhythm of sonar pings fading into eternity. The war that once echoed across the oceans has ended, but the sound never truly died. It became the heartbeat of the sea itself. If this story moved you, don't let it fade beneath the waves. Subscribe for more forgotten chapters of World War II. The machines, the men, and the moments that changed history forever. Like, share, and comment "Echoes never die" to honor those who never surfaced.